Hey, what's going on, gamers? Today we are going to dive headfirst into the Azure Vault to break down routing, important mob mechanics, and general boss fights. Feel free to use the YouTube timeline to navigate to any part of the video you'd like. If you find this video useful, or end up enjoying my voice, hit that subscribe button. I post guides and videos centered around Mythic Plus with an emphasis on tanking, not to mention that subscribing is free. Let's not waste any time though and dive right in. Before we dive into routing, I do want to quickly mention two things. First and foremost, it's the shrieking whelplings that patrol around the vault. It's crucial that you and your group avoid these at all costs unless your group has other plans. They cannot be pulled by proximity like normal mobs, but instead if you walk inside of their circle. If they happen to activate, you can try to CC and stop the shriek, but in higher dungeons it's going to be difficult to burn that much health that quickly. When they do call for aid, they will trigger any nearby dormant enemies, including the Crystal Furies or the Crystal Thrashers. These mobs are extremely deadly, but I will cover them later in the video. Later on in the dungeon as well, you will be able to interact with different arcane books. The main purpose of these is that they carry you from certain platforms of the dungeon, but they do also provide you and your group with random buffs. I'm not going to go through every buff in this video, but some grant haste to nearby allies and enemies, damage reduction but reduced movement speed, or an aura that reduces enemy movement speed, and so on. Typically, most of them have like some kind of kiss curse effect, but I'll probably do a separate video discussing the mechanics of these books. Alright, this dungeon is pretty simple when it comes to routing. You can pretty much hold W and you'll be fine on percentage. To start, you're going to find Conjured Lashers, and these mobs only have one cast, but it should be stopped at all costs. The cast is called Mystic Vapor, and this will apply a really nasty magical debuff to all party members, and it can stack. If this gets off, healers should dispel themselves or whoever is most susceptible to magic damage. The good news is, as soon as the cast starts, it goes on a 15-second internal cooldown, meaning that you can use AoE or single target CC to stop these casts, on top of also using your interrupt. You'll find these lashers throughout the first area of the dungeon all the way up to Leymor. The other important mob is going to be the Arcane Tender, which are these ugly fellas. They will cause void zones to spawn, just be sure to avoid it. Their other cast is also called Erratic Growth. This should be kicked if possible. It'll stun the target for 6 seconds if it gets off. While this can be dispelled, it has a 6-yard aura, and if this expires or is dispelled with any other allies in the circle, they will also be stunned as well. DPS and healers alike should be paying attention to this. Lastly, how I would pull this part of the dungeon is to get lashers back to minimize the risk of pulling the shriekers, and once your path is clear, you should jump down into the boss room. Again, routing is fairly subjective, but I've seen a lot of dungeons go south if this early trash is pulled incorrectly. Once you're in the boss room, you'll need to clear the slimes and the arcane tenders. Feel free to pull all three as long as your groups have kicks under control. Leymor is a fabulous boss. I've already posted 1-minute boss guides for these. The card for that video will be on screen or also in the description of this video. I'm going to just brush up on the mechanics here, but I don't want to waste too much time. Tank, just be sure to aim the boss at the sprouts. His frontal should clear a few. And then when explosive brand is applied to you and your group, spread out and make sure you're using the circle to hit as many sprouts as possible to clear the room. All sprouts that are destroyed will spawn slimes. Once this happens, try to move to the boss so you can group up adds quickly and help your healer out, and then just rinse and repeat. Once Leymor falls, you and your group will head down the stairs to the upper chamber. Ideally, you'll skip around these shriekers here. These circles shrink and expand, so just wait for there to be enough room to pass through. You'll then find 2 arcane elementals standing guard. They have 2 casts. First, Arcane Bolt should be stopped if possible to minimize damage. It will be casted at just random party members. The important cast is actually Waking Bane though. If this cast gets off, the player targeted will be put to sleep for a few seconds. This should be dispelled if possible. Next, click on the Arcane Book, which will take you into the inner ring. Before you can go to the lower ring in this dungeon, you need to actually clear this entire platform, so go either way you would like. I should also mention that classes that have fall damage reduction can jump down below. This won't be a normal strategy though. Here you'll find more arcane elementals alongside some of the other dangerous mobs, including the Crystal Furies and the Crystal Thrashers that I mentioned before, but this time you have to deal with them. The Furies have a massive frontal called Piercing Shards, so tanks, be sure to aim this away from your group. They also have a cast called Arcane Fury, which increases their damage done by 35%. You can use CC to prevent or delay these casts if you would like. Just be sure that you use mitigation and defensive cooldowns regardless, since most of the time, you'll have a minimum of 2 of these in every active pull. The Thrashers will target party members with Splintering Shards, just be sure to spread out for this cast. Lastly, they will cast Crystalline Rupture, which will deal magic damage and root all players caught within the circle for 6 seconds. Alone, these mobs aren't dangerous, but together can really show some nasty overlaps. When running away from the Thrashers, tanks, make sure you stay away from your allies and vice versa to prevent frontal cleaves. You'll also have to deal with 3 unstable curators. Make sure you kick the heavy tome cast whenever it's possible. The scariest cast though is going to be the Forbidden Knowledge, which will spawn swirls, which if it hits you, will cause you to take high arcane damage and disorient you for 4 seconds. This is more problematic for tanks than anything, since getting disoriented causes mobs to attack your allies. Again, alone, these mobs are easy, but when you add in roots and sleeps from the Furies and the Arcane Elementals and the other mobs can make this pull extremely deadly. The last mob you're going to find on this platform is called a Runeseal Keeper. Their main source of damage is going to come from their condensed frost cast. Just avoid the swirls on the ground. But, more importantly, make sure you're kicking the cast Icy Bindings. While this mob can be stunned and CC'd, it will always cast this every 12 to 13 seconds, so ideally 2 melee kicks will be needed. Like I said earlier, being rooted with any of the curators active is pretty much a death sentence. Once the upper platform is cleared, you can head down to the lower platform. Once down here, you don't actually need to clear this platform at all. I recommend going to the right to avoid the Arcane Elementals since it's an easier time handling the Furies with the Curator. The only new mob here is going to be the Arcane Constructs. Tanks, just be careful of their Arcane Bash, which will deal damage and knock you backwards. Make sure you aren't getting launched off the edge. Once you reach the opposite end of the platform, you can interact with the new Arcane Book to take you over towards Azureblade's quarters. And then moving into this area of the dungeon, there isn't really much to know. The Vault Guards will take reduced damage from their Brilliant Scales debuff. If you can, try to purge these. It will help your group defeat them faster. You'll also see a few Runeseal Keepers throughout the room. Just remember to kick their Icy Bindings and you'll be fine. Lastly, there is a patrolling mob called the Scalebane Lieutenant. This boss is an aura that will buff all nearby enemies, giving them increased damage. Pulling him with other mobs is going to be at your own risk. He also has a frontal, so tanks just try not to play Russian roulette. Now, you don't need to clear the entire room, but you'll need 70% count before you leave this area. Also, this boss spawns adds randomly, so if you decide not to clear the full room, just be sure to be careful of whichever mobs still reside in the room. That was quite a meaty part of the dungeon, but should be pretty much smooth sailing from here. Azureblade has a frontal called Arcane Cleave. Tanks and melee, just be aware of this cast. Don't be stacked. Whenever ads spawn, make sure you're interrupting and killing them as fast as possible, and then when Azureblade actually reaches 0 energy, he will run to the center of the room and effectively become immune to damage. At this point, you just need to make sure you kill ads and dodge orbs to get through the intermission, and then rinse and repeat. Full detailed boss guides will be released in future weeks in the season, going over strats and tips. The rest of the dungeon is pretty much smooth sailing. As long as you have around 70-71%, you should just hold W until you reach Telash Greywing. The first mob you're going to run into is a Draconoid Breaker. He does have a target ability called Shoulder Slam. This can be casted on anyone in your party and will deal physical damage while also knocking that player backwards. They also have a fair bit of AoE damage with Bestial Roar, which is a 30-yard AoE. This means that if you're a ranged player, you should try to stay between 31 and 40 yards away to minimize damage. The Null Magic Hogsworns will leap around. Just stay spread out if you have a Draconoid Breaker, but once he's defeated, try to move into melee so you can gain effective cleave to kill them faster. Lastly, we have the Tear Flesh from the Tarasek Delver, which applies a really nasty bleed to the tank. If you decide to pull big, just make sure you're using some solid defenses when you reach higher stacks. Besides that, you basically just hold W until you reach Telash. Mr. Greywing is a very simple fight. Just keep the rooms clear of the Frost Bomb debuffs. When these debuffs are applied, spread out, and then ideally leave them near the edge of the arena or near old pools. Rotate around the room whenever the boss zooms to the center of the room, and be sure to stand inside one of the runes. I do want to note though, everyone needs to stand inside the same rune. If you spread out, both runes will be consumed and will become unavailable, severely shortening how long your group will be able to last on this boss encounter. And again, my relatively more detailed 1-minute boss guides are in the description below. The end of the dungeon is just a boss rush, so take one of the arcane books down below to face off against Umbrelskul. This boss can be a bit of a headache with the oppressive miasma debuff. I recommend tanks pulling her towards the edge of the room, and this will allow crystals to be more generally stacked up to have an easier time destroying them. Once the boss reaches 75, 50, and 25%, crystals will spawn, and then you want to kill these immediately. Try to minimize your movement if possible, but you do need to run away from the arcane orbs that chase players. Healers, try to dispel actively on this fight whenever your group members need assistance. And then lastly, there is a frontal. It doesn't just face the tank, but instead a random group member, so just be paying attention to that. And then just a side note, the miasma debuff can actually be removed or ignored with a bunch of different player abilities. Not only dispels, but things like Tiger's Lust, Post Haste, Blade Storm, Shapeshifting, Freedom, and a bunch of others. Once the boss's health reaches 0, you should be set. I think I covered all the basics for this dungeon. I tried to keep this as short as possible since it's really hard for me to make guides like these because I normally always want to end up ranting for hours about all the different routes and optimizations with kicks and CC and damage. Don't you worry though, throughout the season I will definitely be making more videos and commentary guides for new and more complicated strats in Mythic Plus. Well, at least that's the hope. If you're looking for more content, check me out on Twitch. While I don't necessarily have a stream schedule, I stream fairly often. And then a massive shout out to Nico, Roke, and Antonio, and all my other Patreons. Without them, there'd be much less of, well, this. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.